Thank you very much. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I talked at length with Liz and several of other district leaders back in October in Denver. And the more I heard about the work all of you are doing here, the more interested I became to try to understand this important work and the ways in which you may really be creating a model for educators around the country. So I'm really looking forward to spending some time talking with you tonight. I've already apologized in advance to the folks on the stage for having my back to them, but I like to kind of be close to the audience. I start with this quote from Einstein. The formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. You guys are an incredible school system. Why change? What's the problem? If it ain't broke, why are you trying to fix it? You know, when we talk about failing schools, we're talking about those schools over there. We're not talking about your schools, are we? Well, here's my view. When we talk about failing schools and the need to reform them, we're not diagnosing the problem clearly and effectively. We don't need to reform our failing schools. We need to reinvent the education system for all of our students for the 21st century. And lest you think that a kind of a utopian notion, I'd like to remind folks that as we transitioned from a rural agrarian economy to an urban industrial society, we reinvented the one-room schoolhouse and created the assembly line, factory model, batch processing schools to fit the industrial era. Problem is, that was more than a century ago. And we don't have an industrial age anymore. We have a knowledge and innovation-driven economy that demands fundamentally different things from all of our kids. As we think about reinvention, there are two challenges that I think we must sort of deal with uppermost. Number one, knowledge today has become a commodity. It's free. How many of you have been on the Khan Academy websites? Raise your hands. So you know. Any of you planning to take any of these online college courses from Udacity, Coursera, edX? Raise your hands. Very, very quickly, kids will be able to get an entire college education and never leave their room. It's a commodity. It's free. It's like air. It's like water. It's also growing exponentially and changing constantly. How many of you had to memorize the periodic table? Raise your hands. Right? We all did, right? Now, if you're a chemistry teacher, you can't answer this question. But for the rest of us, I'm going to ask you, how many elements are there? Note the dead silence in the room. Nobody remembers, right? Well, whatever number you come up with is wrong because 2 more were added last month. And Pluto. Poor Pluto, really. Having been a planet all those years and then to get kicked out of the club. Knowledge changing constantly. And it's on every internet-connected device. Let's have a contest. Let's see which one of you can recite the 50 state capitals from memory while I Google them. Let's see who's quicker. So you get the idea. So given that you no longer have to go to school to acquire knowledge, what's school for? What's a teacher for? What's the value added of a teacher if it isn't to impart knowledge? So that's challenge one. The second challenge is very related. The nature of work, in part because knowledge has become so ubiquitous, available everywhere, the nature of work is changing fundamentally. Structured, routine work is disappearing, gone. It's rapidly being either automated or offshored at a stunning pace. The kinds of jobs our young people will get will not be the conventional careers of the past. They will have to engage with a series of successive challenges in their lives, some of which they are going to have to invent. They're going to be very different kinds of jobs. How do we prepare kids for that future? What does that mean? These are the questions that have preoccupied me for the last 7 or 8 years. It began when I started reading a book called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. How many of you have read that book? Many of you, right? What became clear to me as I read that book is that the world simply no longer cares how much our kids know. What the world cares about is what they can do with what they know, which is a completely different education problem. Now the problem becomes, do students have the skill and the will? Content knowledge is not enough. Skill and will become the value added. So what does that mean for us? That's the question of skill was the one that I began with. And so I started interviewing a wide variety of executives, from Apple to Unilever to the U.S. military, trying to understand what are the most important skills today. I talked to community leaders, trying to understand if the skills for citizenship are the same as those for work. And I came to understand that there's a set of core competencies every young person must be well on the way to mastering before he or she completes high school. Not just to get and keep a good job, but equally important for continuous learning and for active and informed citizenship in a global economy. Very briefly, they are: number one, critical thinking and problem solving. Now, already there's a problem for us here, because for us in education, critical thinking is a buzzword. We're not really accountable to teach it. It's not on the test. So you ask us as educators, we're likely to say, yeah, well, critical thinking, that's sort of like thinking critically. It's kind of a circular thing. But out there, over and over, the most common response I got from executives was critical thinking begins with the ability to ask really good questions. Not have the right answers, ask the right questions. Turns out that problem identification is even more highly prized as a skill than problem solving. And that demands asking a rigorous set of questions. Collaboration across networks and leading by influence was the second competency I learned about. Increasingly, not only is work being done in teams everywhere except in education, but more and more it's being done virtually. So when IBM has a new customer need, they pull together teams from around the world to work on that problem because they want solutions to be applicable in different countries and cultures, requiring, therefore, the need to deeply understand and appreciate differences within your team and in the world where you're working. But the way these teams are led is profoundly different than 25 years ago. They're led by peers through influence. Little problem. How do we, who have rarely, if ever, experienced teamwork in the workplace as educators, going to teach that skill to young people? How are we going to ensure that every young person learns to lead peers through influence? Number three, agility and adaptability. Pace of change, the complexity of problems demands that people be agile and adaptable. The fourth survival skill, initiative and entrepreneurialism. It was Mark Chandler, then Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Cisco Systems, the high-tech company, who talked to me about how large corporations like his worry constantly about how to keep that entrepreneurial spirit and initiative alive. He said, if I have an employee who sets and meets 5 goals, that's simply no longer good enough. He said, if on the other hand, I have an employee who sets 10 stretch goals, but maybe only succeeds at 7 or 8, he or she is a hero. But think for a minute. In school, having missed 2 or 3 out of 10, what would that make you? A C or a B student. Not a good risk taker. I'm going to come back to this issue of risk and failure in a few minutes. Fifth survival skill, effective oral and written communication. And it was a senior executive at Dell who said to me, the real reason why these kids can't write, and he was talking about college graduates, he said it's because they don't know how to think. They don't know how to reason. And then he said something quite striking. He said, that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is they do not know how to write with voice, his exact words, meaning they don't know how to put their own passion and perspective into their communication so as to be persuasive, an essential element of effective communication. Sixth survival skill, accessing and analyzing information. We just talked about that, how critically important that is. The last one, curiosity and imagination. Now, how many of you read Dan Pink's book, A Whole New Mind? Raise your hands. Well, as you know, he makes the case for curiosity and imagination in the context of a more sophisticated consumer economy, where more and more we want sophisticated products and services that are beautiful, empathetic, and so on. But I've come to see the need for curiosity and imagination in a whole new light in the context of my recent work, which I want to talk about. So the global achievement gap, the title of the last book, is the gap between the new skills all students need versus what is taught and tested even in our very best public and independent schools in this country. Increasingly, what I see in schools in this country is one curriculum, test prep. And the problem is that the overwhelming majority of tests we're using are factual, recall, multiple choice tests that tell us absolutely nothing about career or citizenship readiness in the 21st century. I believe in accountability and assessment. The problem is we're trying to do accountability on the cheap, using old methodologies that don't apply to these new outcomes. So when this book came out 4.5 years ago, a couple of things happened pretty quickly. Number one, I began getting requests from all over the world to come speak to leadership audiences, from Taiwan to Singapore to Thailand to Bahrain, from Finland, Spain, England, West Point to Wall Street. I don't know how many states and conferences. And everywhere I went, people sort of nodded like that. Yep, these are exactly the right skills. But when we started talking about reinventing education, they began to sort of get a little nervous. Because it's a whole new idea. We teach in the ways that we've been taught. As parents, we want schools to look like the ones we went to. Reinvention, that seems too radical, too crazy. So then the second thing happened that began to put all of this in a different light. And I'm talking about the global economic collapse, from which we are still struggling and suffering. Where for the first time we saw kids who were college graduates coming home with a BA in one hand, $25,000 of debt in the other hand, on average, and no job. All right, throw out a number. Little guessing game here. What do you think is the percentage of recent college graduates who are and underemployed right now today? Throw out a number, real quick, shout it out. 53% of all recent BA college graduates are either or underemployed. Economists are more and more coming to a consensus. One word: innovation. And the whole idea is not just STEM, science, technology, engineering, but the idea is that we have to educate young people to be creative problem solvers in whatever it is they do. That's my definition of an innovator. Someone who is a creative problem solver in whatever it is they do. It doesn't have to be high-tech for STEM. It can be incremental improvements and innovations. All right, so we've always been known as a very innovative country. Is that because of the availability of venture capital, copyright protection laws, infrastructure, until recently a liberal immigration policy, all reasons that people give? What about our education system? Been part of the problem or part of the solution? Here's my one Trivial Pursuit question for the night. I'm going to ask you to answer it so fast you won't be able to Google it. What do Bill Gates, Edwin Land, the inventor of the Polaroid instant camera, by the way, Bonnie Raitt, the folk singer, and Martin Zuckerberg, the Facebook thing, all four have in common? They were not college dropouts. They were Harvard college dropouts. That's different. That's very different. Steve Jobs, he was just an ordinary college dropout. Michael Dell, an ordinary college dropout. Dean Kamen. I love doing that to Harvard. It makes me feel good inside. So I began to explore the question of what must we do differently as parents, as teachers, mentors, and employers to develop the capabilities of many, many more young people to be creative problem solvers. You know, we're born curious, creative, imaginative. The average 4-year-old asks 100 questions a day. But by the time that child is 8 or 10, or they've learned it's more about getting the right answers than asking questions, right? In Sir Kenneth Robinson's words, we school these qualities out of kids. So I started interviewing a wide variety of young people in their 20s who were highly innovative. Some in science, technology, and engineering, some in the arts, some social entrepreneurs. Trying to understand what were the forces that had supported and encouraged them to become young innovators and entrepreneurs. I interviewed all their parents, seeing if I could discern patterns of parenting. I asked each one of them, was there a teacher or a mentor who made a significant difference? Most could name at least one teacher. Rarely could they name more than one. Teachers were elementary all the way through to graduate school. I interviewed all of those teachers, and I discovered a pattern that I continue to find deeply disturbing. In every single case, the teachers that had made the greatest difference in the lives of these young innovators was an outlier in his or her educational or institutional setting, teaching in ways that were radically different than his or her peers, but remarkably consistent with one another, I learned as I observed their classes. Then I went to those few schools that have reputations for graduating young innovators. I'm talking about High Tech High in San Diego, the New Tech High Network, the MIT Media Lab, a new media lab, the Olin College of Engineering in Massachusetts, brand new college, arguably one of the best in the country today, the D School at Stanford. And what I saw again was a pattern, that there was remarkable similarities in the kinds of teaching I saw there from high school to graduate school, and it was completely consistent with how my outliers were teaching. And so what I've come to realize is that the culture of schooling, as we've practiced it for generations, is radically at odds with the culture of learning to become an innovator in 5 essential respects. Number 1, culture of schooling celebrates and rewards individual achievement. Well, that's fine, except that innovation is a team sport. And in every case, these teachers had built accountable teamwork into every lesson and valued collaboration every bit as much as they valued individual achievement. Number 2, culture of schooling is all about compartmentalization of knowledge and specialization. We divide and conquer the high school universe by something we call Carnegie units, a system that is more than 1 century old, unchanged. Go to college, you have a major. You want to teach in college, you're supposed to know this much about something that tiny. Problem is, as Director of Talent at Google, Judy Gilbert said to me, if there's one thing educators must realize, it's that problems can neither be understood nor solved within the bright lines of specific academic disciplines. The third problem and contradiction between the culture of schooling and the culture of learning to become an innovator is the process of learning itself. Sadly, the process of learning in most of our schools is all too often a passive experience. At best, it's a guess what's on the teacher's mind kind of an experience. But it's all about consuming information. Maybe that's in fact where we learn to be such good little consumers. But not so in these classrooms that we're teaching innovators. In every case, they were having to create, not consume. They were having to use and apply their knowledge to create real products for real audiences, answers to open-ended questions that didn't have a right or wrong answer. Very, very different. Now, these last 2 contradictions, I think, are the most challenging for all of us. Contradiction number 4, culture of schooling penalizes failure, and we reward compliance. And in so doing, we've created a kind of risk-averse culture for kids, and I think for many adults. The problem is, the culture of innovation demands risk-taking and learning from mistakes. I went to IDEO, the most successful design company, an innovative design company in the world, came to find out their company motto is fail early and fail often. Heck of a way to run a company, really. Except that when they explained it, it made sense. They said there is no innovation without trial and error. Can't happen. I went to the D School at Stanford. We were talking about this, and the teacher was saying, yeah, you know, we got a real problem here. We're actually thinking the grade of F is the new A. Meaning the kids who have tried something and, quote, failed, may have actually learned more than the A kid who never took a risk and never really learned it. Now, I don't recommend adopting that grading standard just yet right now in Douglas County. I finally talked to a young woman at the Olin College of Engineering who put it all in perspective for me. She said, you know, we don't even talk about failure here. We don't think like that. We talk about iteration. My new favorite word, iteration. Going from 1.0 to 2.0, where they are learning to reflect on their work, to figure out what they did well, what they didn't, and how to apply that learning to their next project or endeavor. This last contradiction, I think, is in many ways one that we all must, as parents and teachers, work with together. The culture of schooling motivates kids. I said I was going to talk about skill and will. This is the will side. We motivate kids through a combination of extrinsic incentives, carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments, A's and F's, money for good grades. But in every case, the young innovators whom I interviewed were far, far more intrinsically motivated, wanting to make a difference more than they wanted to make a lot of money. Kids from privilege, kids from poverty, equally intrinsically motivated. And then when I went back to try to understand what did their parents and teachers do to reinforce and stimulate that intrinsic motivation that we're born with, I saw another pattern. Both parents and teachers across all of these case studies encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraging more exploratory, discovery-based play, fewer toys, toys without batteries, less structured time, telling kids to get outside and play. As one mom said, sometimes kids have to learn to be bored in order to learn to get unbored. Her son later went to be the product manager for the first iPhone. I guess he figured that out. Teachers adding an element of play into their assignments. It was Ed Carrier, smart product design teacher at Stanford University's engineering school, who talked about adding an element of whimsy into every assignment he gave teams of students. But as these kids were, quote, playing, parents were observing carefully, trying to understand what is it that they are really interested in, and trying to intentionally create a buffet of opportunities for them to explore interests. Because these parents valued the idea of their children finding and pursuing a passion more highly than just academic achievement for its own sake. Because they realized that it's the pursuit of a real interest that is the heartbeat of self-discipline, persistence, tenacity, being able to recover from mistakes, grit as they're calling it. That's where it comes from. Teachers did the same. They built opportunities for kids to explore ideas that they were interested in, to learn something they were interested in, to design their own investigations, ask their own questions into a part of every course. Then as these kids grew older and matured, their passions evolved. They didn't stay the same as they got exposed to new things and different ideas. But in every case, they matured into a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to give back or make a difference. Qualities that both the parents and the teachers had encouraged and supported by simply saying, we're not on this earth only for ourselves. There is some responsibility we all have, even if it's in a very modest way, to in some way give back or make a difference. So there's a lot we can say about the implications for education in the 21st century, and I'm really looking forward to exploring some of these ideas with our audience. But I would simply end with two sort of ideas. One is we have to start assessing the skills that matter most. What gets assessed is what gets taught. And we're going to have to develop Accountability 2.0, both nationally and at the state level and at the local level. I would like, for example, to see every student start school with a digital portfolio, where each child is developing a body of work that shows evidence of progressive mastery of the skills that matter most. I would like to see us use a sampling or auditing strategy so that we can afford to use dramatically better tests that are out there, like the College and Work Readiness Assessment. That's on the skill set. I'd like to see us encourage teachers to do educational R&D. I saw some wonderful teaching this afternoon. I think we need to encourage and incent teachers to do the kind of R&D that is required to develop these new approaches to assessment. On the will side, I would simply have a modest proposal. How many of you know the Google 20% rule? Raise your hands. The idea is if you work for Google, you have permission to play on company time 1 day a week. You have a day a week to work on any project of your choice. It has been the greatest single engine of innovation in the corporation. And they're not the only company. 3M has had a 15% rule for many years, right? What if we introduced the Google rule into every classroom in America? What if we said to every student, you're going to have 20% of your time to work on projects of your choosing. And yes, we want you to write about that and speak about that, and all goes into your digital portfolio, and we're going to sit in conference with you and talk about what you've learned and reflect on that and set new learning goals periodically. but you're going to be responsible for your own learning. In the best preschools and elementary schools, it isn't a 20% rule, it's a 100% rule. You go to a Montessori school, you go to a Reggio Emilia classroom, you see kids 100% of the time motivated by their own interests in learning. And what we've discovered is that some of the most well-known and successful innovators and entrepreneurs in this country have one thing in common that people hadn't realized until recently. Huge numbers of them went, in fact, to Montessori schools. So as we think about educating young people for the 21st century, it's not just new skills. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of thinking about how to solve problems creatively. It's bringing a set of dispositions to creative problem solving that I think are critical. And I would finally suggest that, the good news from what I've seen this afternoon in visiting your classes is you guys have teachers who are already doing all of these things, committed to doing these things. So the challenge now is, I think, for you as a district to think about how do you make these extraordinary acts of great teaching the norm in all of your classrooms in Douglas County. Thank you.
We really want to hear the questions most on your mind after hearing Dr. Wagner talk about, I know some of the things that I hear a lot of times are, okay, but what about higher ed? And so I don't know if Vince is going to be the one to ask that question, maybe Andy, but I know that's always on the mind of high school teachers because as a former high school teacher, we really felt like that's what our job was, to prepare students for college, and we knew what that looked like based on admissions requirements and those kind of things. So I'm not trying to tell you guys what to ask, but but that's one. But Andy's ready. Okay.
Yeah, that is my question, Dr. Wagner. Is obviously we have a great district, a high-performing district, and I'm part of a high-performing high school with great teachers who are doing a great job every day, and we have a strong parent community that has high expectations on us to prepare their kids for the future, and that future, in large part, is a majority of students graduating from Rock Canyon High School are going on to college. And so I'm wondering. What initiatives are at the collegiate level? What's being done right now? Do they have a strong sense of changing how they do education, particularly in those first couple years with students, and getting away from some of the large lecture scenarios?
There's some threads of hope. Right now there are 750 colleges and universities in this country, including very selective schools like Bates, Bowdoin, Colby, that do not require any form of standardized testing for admissions. Because there is a growing awareness that, in fact, standardized tests, whether they're SATs or even semester-long test bases like advanced placement, are in fact a terrible predictor of college success. So we're seeing a lot of colleges begin to move away, and I'm convinced that if very good districts like this one start saying to colleges, look, yeah, we'll send you a transcript, but we're also going to give you access, selective access to a student's digital portfolio. You're going to learn a lot more from that. Tufts University last year became the first college in the country to invite applicants to submit YouTube videos as a part of the application. And they were stunned at the quality of what they found. I also find that the colleges now are going to be under tremendous pressure with these new massively open online courses, MOOCs, where more and more kids are going to say, why should I go to college? They're going to have to show some value added. They're going to have to answer the question, what's a teacher for besides a lecture? So I think they're going to be under more and more pressure to themselves innovate in order to maintain a market share. By the way, I do have to address the AP question because I know advanced placement is popular here, but my colleague was talking to some teachers at Stanford recently, science teachers, and they're saying, actually, kids who get 5s on APs are a real problem at Stanford. They need remediation because they know how to spout answers, but they don't have any conceptual understanding. One of the highest performing public high schools in this entire country, Scarsdale High School, abolished APs 5 years ago. Teachers rebelled. They said it's stuffing the goose and we're not persuaded that it's good learning. They took a risk. They gambled. What would happen to their admission to selective schools? Well, it went up, not down. More and more colleges are recognizing that advanced placement is not the gold standard for intellectual rigor any longer.
Listening to you tonight, we didn't hear much on content. I didn't hear curriculum. I'm pretty sure you didn't use the words Common Core. What we did hear, though, was a lot about teaching, a lot about learning, and a lot about thinking.
Yeah.
what we heard was research and development for teachers. And one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier in the day that I'd like you to talk a little more about is lesson study.
Yeah.
Which follows along what it is and how it works.
Yeah. Well, let me first address the content issue. Look, content matters. Expertise has value in the marketplace. No question. You know, when the Russians invaded Georgia a few years ago, kids who heard that on television were worried that South Carolina might be next. So content matters. It's a way of orienting to the world. It matters. But it's one leg of a three-legged stool in preparing young people for the future. The second leg is skills. What can you do with what you know? And the marketplace out there in the world of work values skills more highly than content. Over and over, employers will say, look, I can teach them the content. Besides, it's going to change. I'm going to have to teach them the content. But I can't teach them how to think. I can't teach them how to communicate effectively. And the third leg of the stool, arguably the most important and the one least attended to, is will or motivation. This new book out, How Children Succeed, is a powerful description of all the research that motivation actually matters more than intelligence in terms of adult outcomes. Because if you have the motivation, you will acquire new content knowledge as needed. Sure, you need expertise, but when and where and how you acquire it and with what motivation matters hugely. You acquire all this content when you have no reason to know it, you won't remember it. So motivation matters. Motivation is also what will help you to acquire new skills throughout your life. So all three legs of the stool are important. And the sad thing about most of the curriculum work we have done thus far is that it only focuses on the first of the three. And this brings me to lesson study. I mean, the challenge for us as teachers, and I'm a recovering high school English teacher. I spent 12 years in the classroom, and I still think of this as my classroom. How do we get better? How do we improve? Formal evaluations, as we know, in most districts, rarely give us any useful feedback at all. So how do we get better? Well, I think what we need to engage in as a part of our professional culture is something that's called lesson study, where we get used to the idea, first of all, of working in teams, second of all, of observing one another's classes or having our classes videotaped, and then talking about how do we improve this lesson, which is different than being evaluated as a teacher. That's formal, that's for, promotion or tenure or whatever. But lesson study ought to be embedded in the culture of every single school and in the heart and soul of every one of us as a professional. I have never taught a perfect lesson. None of us have. Well, maybe one or two. But for the most part, really, we know that. How are we going to improve? How do we know what to work on? So it's not just, getting criticism, but also getting warm feedback, too, knowing what we did well. So we need to create these professional learning cultures around lesson study, in my view.
I would argue that probably most of the people in the audience are somewhere on the bus with everything that you have said tonight. And it's very encouraging, all of the words of wisdom that you have given us. What I'm wondering is, at some point, a teacher always feels like they are up against a roadblock because of educational policy. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what policies out there would be good ones to change or modify, and how can educators help?
I was in the Department of Education 3 weeks ago talking to Jim Shelton and Deb Delisle, and I found them more receptive than I expected, quite frankly, to the conversation we're having tonight. I think they're beginning to understand that our accountability system does not incent powerful teaching and learning, the teaching and learning that our kids want and that our economy needs. I think they feel stymied by Capitol Hill, frankly. When I start talking about using an auditing strategy for assessments, essentially that enables you to sample, say, student digital portfolios or use some of these better tests, that made sense to them. So when they said, well, look, we'll never get it past the hill, I said, don't try, go around, don't go over the hill. And this is what I mean. And this is I think a powerful sort of story for folks here in Colorado. The Nation at Risk came out in 1983, the study of how our schools are failing. For the next 5 years, exactly nothing happened in education. Until in 1988, Lou Gerstner from IBM and David Kearns from Xerox called for a national summit on education. All the governors came, all the CEOs came. Educators were not invited to that summit, by the way. True story. They weren't trusted. It's hard to trust somebody who has a job for life with no apparent accountability. So they didn't trust them. I understand that. But we got Accountability 1.0 from that effort because those business leaders started pressuring legislatures. That's how we got Accountability 1.0. I think we desperately need Accountability 2.0 in this country at the local, state, and national level, and the only way we're going to get it is for business leaders and educators to work together to design an accountability system that assesses the outcomes that matter most and incents powerful teaching and learning. And we as citizens are going to have to demand this in order for it to happen.
This kind of goes along with it a little bit. When you're really looking at the models that are set up right now, as we're moving towards this teacher-centered model to a student-centered model where the teacher needs facilitation skills around, communication, collaboration, and doing that. But the problem is the prep programs that we have now in higher education don't push
Disasters.
that. So,
I mean, I just couldn't agree more. I'm sorry. I apologize for interrupting you, but I just feel so strongly about this. The schools of education are bankrupt. It's interesting that when Finland worked to transform its entire education system 35 years ago, the first thing they did was radically upgrade teacher preparation, closing down 4/5 of all teacher preparation programs. There are only 8 in the country today. They're all affiliated with the best universities, and every teacher has to have a master's degree that includes both real research in their content area as well as a year-long residency with a master teacher in teams. So that's, I think, the model. And again, I think it is incumbent upon a district like Douglas County, where a lot of people want to come to teach, to start saying to schools of ed, hey, we don't like what you're turning out. High Tech High, my favorite school, it's actually not a school, it's a district with 4,000 kids, K-12, was so dissatisfied with graduates from schools of ed, they started their own graduate school of education. It's the only one I can recommend enthusiastically right now.
Dr. Wagner, I'm a brand new principal. My middle school feeds into Andy's high school. We're a very high-performing middle school, which Dr. Fagan said I'm very proud of. I have parents who come to me and I want to know where my child is in algebra to get to geometry because I have to get to BC Calc to get into CU. So do you have words of advice on how I communicate that to a community of where the new skill set is and why I haven't purchased a math book to tell them what page they're on every night?
I think this is a huge challenge because I suggested earlier, parents want schools to look like the ones they went to. And you layer onto that the fact that parents today are very frightened. They see a far more competitive world for their children than the one they grew up in. And they are desperate to know what is the competitive advantage they can give their child. And so they fall back on what they know. And so it is then demands that we help adults construct an understanding of a radically new and different world. And just as Dr. Fagan leads educators through a conversation about, well, what skills was Henry Ford hiring for and what skills does Nike or Google hire for, we need to do the same thing for our parents and community members. Living in the midst of change, you can't see it. It's happened so quickly. So we're going to have to design sort of whether it's community reads or conversations where, we get college teachers and employers together on panels to talk about the skills that are required to be successful in both places. We're going to have to expend some of our time and effort helping parents understand this new world. The other thing I would only add that it's very hard to do that work alone. I think I would recommend, since you guys are on the same stage together, you get your 8th and 9th grade teachers talking to each other and start talking together so that there's a more unified sort of stance with parents about what's important grades 6 through 12 and what you're working on collaboratively that will make a difference for kids.
Hi, Dr. Wagner.
Can we do Tony? Would that work for you? Is that right?
Yeah, new Tony. Sure.
All right, good.
Call me Vince.
Checking. All right.
Yeah, okay, perfect. My limited knowledge of High Tech High, one of the things I think I understand that maybe you can share a bit about is what's the respect between teacher and student there? When I think about reforming education, the idea of our traditional role has been to pass down information. We're the experts. We're all knowing. You're just little kids that just don't know anything.
Yeah,
so
we fill up empty vessels.
That's right. And so, but I also see, I think a lot of people have a component of, they believe that a big part of what we're supposed to do is teach kids to be obedient and compliant and well behaved and whatever word you want to use there. So I guess I'm wondering if you can share kind of your thoughts on whether high tech high or the role of teachers.
No, I'd love to talk about that, but let me start with obedience and compliance. Out there in the marketplace, obedience and compliance will get you jobless, period. You know, my wife was a corporate consultant for a period of time, worked for a consulting company. She'd get kids out of the best business schools who would come to her and say, tell me what to do. And she said, no, you got to go figure out what's the problem and how to solve it. I'm not going to tell you how to get an A or what to do. So obedience and compliance has no market value any longer out there in the world. And that gets back to why we're trying to educate very, very differently. But then what's the role of the teacher? With respect, I would not use the term facilitator that was mentioned earlier. I think the best analogy is a good teacher is an effective coach. Same kind of coaching that you see on the playing fields or in the performing arts. You're coaching to excellence. You're coaching to a higher performance standard with your kids. And if you look at the delicate balance of coaching, there's a certain kind of camaraderie, a certain kind of even intimacy between the adult and the young person being coached, but also a clear understanding of the coach's expertise and skillfulness. Interesting, though, at High Tech High, the model there is teams of teachers have shared responsibility for a group of students over time. And I think that's another aspect of being a teacher in the 21st century, the idea of working on a team. The idea of having a shared responsibility for a group of kids, as I saw in one of your middle schools today. I think that should be the norm throughout our schools, where we get to know our kids well. You cannot coach a stranger. You guys are dealing with horrendous class sizes. I realize that. I know that's not the fault of the district. That is a statewide education funding problem. But I think you're going to have to look creatively at how to have teams of teachers work with groups of kids so the kids don't fall through the cracks.
Thanks, Tony.
Was that hard?
It was hard.
I know. I'm so sorry.
One of the things, the concepts that I really appreciated about your book was that idea of play, passion, and purpose. And even appreciated the word whimsy that somebody you had quoted and talked about. One of the things that as teachers, and I'm down at the bottom, I'm a first grade teacher, that we really are also mindful of is that concept of scope and sequence and collaborating and, sort of ensuring that we have a common understanding of what skills are passed on. What I'm wondering is how that sort of plays into getting to know that child clearly, like you talked about, almost, in a teaching to the child, not to the curriculum, and keeping that sense of play and whimsy. At the same time, being accountable if you have some thoughts on some of that flexibility and agility for a teacher.
Oh, that's a great question. Again, I turn to Finland, which is the highest performing education system in the world. It's also an economy that is ranked number one in entrepreneurship and innovation in the world, more highly than ours. Well, how did they get there from being a poor agrarian economy 35 years ago? And what was their secret sauce for teaching? We've already talked about teacher preparation. But they initially had national curriculum frameworks. But as they realized that they had educated their teachers to such a high professional standard, they realized they had to trust them. So the motto in Finland is trust through professionalism, not carte blanche trust. It's quid pro quo, right? We've trained you to be a professional, you act like a professional, and so we're going to trust you. And we're going to trust you to use your judgment, but we're going to give you the tools you need. So looping is the norm in elementary teachers in Finland, in elementary schools. You spend 2 or 3 years with the same group of kids. They call you by their first name, by the way. It's very informal. And the kids take off their shoes when they come into school. The schools themselves are much smaller, average of 300 in size. So that the teachers know each other and they know the kids. And I think that is a huge element of being able to personalize learning. But there are still national curriculum frameworks. But right now, they're guidelines that teachers know that as professionals, they're going to have to adapt or adopt.
Hi, Tony. We in Douglas County are being afforded as classroom teachers an incredible opportunity to be part of reform, to be part of the process. As we roll up our sleeves and delve into this work of identifying world-class outcomes, world-class targets, and assessment, words of encouragement, words of advice, especially as we try to match authentic performance-based assessment, critical thinking, having our students investigate and inquire with state mandates in testing and federal mandates in testing. And it seems to me that oftentimes it's incongruous, but yet we are moving ahead and we are trusting that the political process will follow our lead in Douglas County, which is on the cutting edge. We are leading currently with this type of reform and teacher involvement. So words of advice, words of wisdom. Keep going.
I'm not sure I have either, but I guess two things come to mind. First of all, historically, education is a risk-averse profession. The problem is to create the education for the future invariably requires taking risks. Individual risks, collective risks. The team that I met with this afternoon in the middle school talked about how they take risks together as a team. It is much easier to take risks if you have a team, because you vet what you're trying to do, you don't take a risk randomly, and you're together in this, helping each other. So that's the first point. Don't do it alone. Isolation is the enemy of innovation and improvement. So I think we need to rethink structures in education so that every teacher is a part of a real team. So that's point one. Point two is I think you have to have the deep, abiding confidence in your kids that if you teach them to use their minds well, they will do just fine on the tests. In fact, they will outscore kids who've only had a test prep curriculum. For so many kids, stuff goes in one ear and out the other. It's like giving kids a box full of Christmas tree ornaments and no tree to hang them on. That's what happens in most classes in America today. So if you give kids a powerful intellectual experience, they will have the skills they need to read those test questions and figure out what are the wrong answers, which will give them a huge leg up in those tests. We know this. We know the schools that really focus with tremendous professionalism and discipline on teaching kids to use their minds well consistently outscore the schools that just do test prep.
Do you guys have any other questions on the side? Otherwise, I was going to take a couple off the paper, but if you have any, I wanted to. Okay. One of the questions it's a long question, but the moral of the story is the person wants to know, since No Child Left Behind, programs have really become in vogue, like, I'm not picking on this program, but this is the one they use as an example, everyday math. So what is your response to the notion of programs? In Douglas County, we don't prescribe one program for everybody, but schools do pick different programs for teaching different things. And this person says, my school is currently using everyday math. What's your response to learning from a program?
Well, I first of all don't know anything about everyday math, and I'm math phobic, so I'm not a good person to ask. That's why I became an English teacher. Couldn't do math. But more seriously, I think one of the problems we have in education today is reform du jour. We're looking for silver bullets all the time, and we haven't trained sufficiently our teachers to be real professionals, and then we don't treat them as professionals. So my view is that the job of the district is to be very clear about the outcomes that matter most, and the assessments that are used. Those should be common. No variance, zero variance. But you vary the amount of time or help a student may need to reach those outcomes, and you give teachers the resources and the flexibility they need to make professional judgments. You cannot standardize teaching. You can't turn it into an assembly line. Not possible.
Another question is, this person is wondering about collaboration. Can you define collaboration? Is the real meaning beyond what mostly occurs in the classroom now, labeled as group work, teamwork, everyone having a say in what goes on, everyone having a part in completing a project? Yeah. When you say collaboration, do you mean that, or do you mean something different?
I mean both individual and collective accountability for a result. Where we as individuals are accountable for a result in a class as students, and I would say the same for adults, and we collectively have a shared accountability, and we are reviewing one another's contributions to that shared accountability and outcome. New Tech High Network has a rubric where every student assesses every other student's teamwork skills at the end of every project. It's a formal part of their grading. I think that's the way it should be. But I think it takes time to really design effective units of study where accountable teamwork is built in and not just a little add-on or a Band-Aid.
Another question, this same one is, and I think this is a great question, how can we be sure that our evaluation of student work and thinking do not become subjective when moving away from traditional testing or the kind of collection of body of evidence? So that's often something that people say is, well, you can't empower teachers with a body of student work because it will be different. It's too subjective.
This problem is solvable. First of all, let's be clear here. Name a corporation, name one, that relies on multiple choice tests for important personnel decisions, for recruitment, hiring, or promotion. What do they rely on? Human judgment. If it's good enough for corporations, why can't it be good enough for education? Now, we have to get better at it. We can't do human judgment as isolated, autonomous individuals. This is where collaboration comes in. We need to do peer reviews of one another's work. We need to do peer reviews of student work. And we need to invite outsiders to audit student work. We need to invite college teachers and employers to look at digital portfolios of students chosen at random so that we are very clear. What is the performance standard that is expected, and are we meeting it? And then we can also use, on an auditing basis, some of these very powerful new tests, like the College and Work Readiness Assessment. I think that combination of three things, peer review, done collectively, not individually, outside auditing of student work, and selective use of high-quality assessments will get us dramatically better results than what we have now.
So this one is, this school is doing a book study on creating innovators. And so some of our conversations have centered around different types or levels of innovation. Could you elaborate on the different types or levels of innovation we might see in a classroom?
I think that's a really interesting question. I have to think some more about it. I don't have a quick answer for you, but I think there's incremental innovation and there's disruptive innovation. Incremental innovation might be just simply using what you think might be a more engaging approach to teaching content that you know you have to teach. Disruptive innovation, well, here's the disruptive innovation I'd frankly like to see throughout education. Instead of a high school diploma, what I would like to see is that every student acquire a series of merit badges. How many of you were in Scouts? Raise your hands. So you know, if you want to get a merit badge in camping as a Boy Scout, you don't study the history of camping. And you certainly don't take a multiple choice test on the parts of a tent. You have to plan a real trip. You have to figure out the equipment, the menus, the routes. You have to learn navigation. You have to learn first aid skills, and you have to conduct a conservation project successfully. All, by the way, judged by adults. So in my view, what we really need to be moving towards in education for the 21st century is designing a series of merit badges where students engage in using rich and challenging content in order to show evidence of mastery of core competencies. For example, a merit badge in scientific literacy would require students, and it's just an example, to ask a question, design an experiment, conduct that experiment, analyze the results, and present the findings. That's how I would earn my merit badge in scientific literacy. So from my point of view, that's a disruptive innovation, but I think it's going to come. Invariably, the world doesn't care what your kids know. It's what they can do with what they know. And that's going to demand radical innovations in teaching, learning, and assessment.
Elementary schools seem like they have more, I mean, this is my personal comment. It seems like there's more freedom in elementary and middle school because you don't feel so tied to higher ed.
Right.
That you could innovate, an elementary school in Douglas County could say, you know, we're going to try this merit badge thing.
Right.
And we're going to set our outcomes and students will earn these.
Doing a project of interest to them, but they have to meet certain performance standards in terms of communication. It would include a research paper. By the way, you could get through an entire AP curriculum, do you know this, and never write a single research paper? That's one of the big flaws of an AP curriculum. No research paper. Unlike...
We actually do have Thunder Ridge High School does have sort of a capstone project for every senior. So we do have that.
So the idea would be here, if you wanted to ease your way into a merit badge approach, say every senior has to earn a merit badge with a project, and then you backwards map those expectations and performance standards to 8th grade and 5th grade. So you begin to have an aligned, coherent series of merit badges through capstone projects. Some schools are already working in that direction right now.
Here's what I think is, unless you guys have more questions, I'm going to ask what I think. Jean does, so I'm going to have one more, and then Jean and Mary, I think, have follow-up questions. But this is a hard one.
Oh, the others were easy?
Well, this is a big question. I like it. It's great. We are trying to create a design school experience at the high school level. What would this look like at the high school level, and how do we balance the need for direct instruction and teacher-directed activities with the need for the students to explore, innovate, and fail?
I don't have a stock answer to that. I think there are schools that are working in those areas now, like High Tech High in San Diego, like the New Tech High Network. There's actually a consortium that is funded by the Hewlett Foundation called the Deeper Learning Network of Schools. And there's more than 13 networks of schools, Expeditionary Learning, Envisions, EdVisions. I would encourage you to go visit those schools. And one of the things that I would encourage this district to consider, I just came from Scarsdale, New York yesterday, where they, for the first time, have created an innovation fund that teams of teachers can apply to for grants to study and develop new innovations that might be scaled up in the district. And for me, this would be a good way of spending some money for teams of teachers, not individuals, to be able to study what different schools are doing and then come back and figure out their own model.
I like that. So, Jean.
It's green. One of the things that I'd like you to talk a little bit about is that culture of collaboration for innovators. And certainly as a first grade teacher in primary, we're kind of all about creating a community and a culture. And specifically, what I found interesting, and I'd love you to address a little bit more, is the concepts of extrinsic rewards and also the concept of competition and how that plays into creating a culture of collaboration and a culture of innovation, creativity.
Well, you guys really ask hard questions. Again, I don't have a quick kind of ready answer for you. I think, human nature invariably, I think, responds to a combination of extrinsic and intrinsic rewards and incentives. We want to be respected by our peers. We like to be acknowledged for excellence by others. I suppose that's a kind of an extrinsic incentive. And that sometimes generates competition. But I think the more productive form of competition is with oneself. This is what I did last semester. Now let me see what I can do this semester. And I think we need to encourage more of that kind of sense of competition with oneself. And even in the business world, they talk about co-opetition these days, where the importance of cooperation and teamwork, not just even within companies, but across companies, is becoming more highly emphasized.
So we only have time for one more question, so you guys are going to have to arm wrestle over there. Rock, paper, scissors. Oh, Vince is going to let Mary have it. So this is the last question of the evening, and then we'll be
I
finished.
have one final comment I'd like to make.
Sure, certainly.
Briefly.
Go ahead, Mary.
Typically, in most school districts, we have a K through 12 vertical alignment. Do you recommend, as we move forward in reinventing education, that we disassociate ourselves with vertical alignment and try to look more at the horizontal alignment in our programming and our choices and also what we're offering? Oftentimes the students in my classroom say, Mrs. Murphy, this is a great class, but what is this course of English going to do for me in the real world, even though I'm trying to make those connections for them? So should we look at horizontally how middle schools across our districts can reinvent some programming or offer different opportunities for students rather than vertical?
Yeah. I gather there's been a long tradition in this county of each school sort of doing their own thing. And I understand and respect that to a degree, but I also think there's a need for consistency, coherence, and continuity for kids. And so I wouldn't do that by compliance, but I would just structure things so that teachers and leaders from all the middle schools meet together regularly to share what they're doing, to communicate, and to learn from each other. Again, I keep coming back to this issue of collaborative problem solving. Collaborative inquiry has to be the new norm in our profession. And that isn't just one school figuring it out all on their own. We have too many random acts of excellence in American education and too little real coherence in what we do. Folks, I guess I get the last word. It's written into an English teacher's contract that you have to, at some point in a class, quote some literature. So, how many of you remember the opening to Tale of Two Cities? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? I don't need to tell you ways in which these are very challenging times in education and have been in recent history here in Douglas County. You know it better than I. you're living it. But what may be harder for you to see is that it is also the best of times. I have the rare privilege of traveling around the country and meeting with extraordinary educators, as I did this afternoon, as I am with you tonight, and seeing the passion, the professionalism, and the commitment to reinventing education for the 21st century. So I simply want to end by thanking you. Thank you for coming out at the end of a very long day. Thank you for the work you do for students every single day. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being the brave folks to sit up here and ask the questions. We really appreciate it. And I know you asked a lot of the questions that others were thinking about. So thank you very much for participating tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Wagner, for being in Douglas County, for visiting classrooms, and for helping us make sure that we're doing the best we can for students in this county. Thank you.